All right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here, and I am back for the second half of chapter 24. Okay, here we are. All right. So I left off talking about Eisenhower coming into office, and then the last thing we said was about the space race, and in 1957, the Soviet Union launched their first artificial satellite, Sputnik, and so that created this whole new tone of the Cold War, okay? So that's where we're going to pick up, all right? Okay, so massive retaliation is the section that I'm looking at, and it's the very bottom of 747. Okay, but so Dwight D. Eisenhower comes into office at a time, like I said, things are shifting. It's a new phase of the Cold War. Okay, so we have our atomic weaponry that we know. And then, this is really launching us into what will become known as the atomic age, okay? But so there's that fear, it's known that the United States has atomic weaponry, and the fear is, will it get to that point that, we have full-on war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which would take the Cold War to a hot war, okay? But so there's that fear spreading across the globe. Okay, so let's look more at the Russians. So Ike and the Russians. All right, after the end of the Korean War and Stalin's death, Eisenhower came to believe that the Soviets were reasonable, and there's more of a willingness to deal in diplomatic terms, okay? So Nikita Khrushchev is in power, the Soviet Union, okay, calls for peaceful coexistence with the U.S., easing some tensions of the Cold War, and this section of the Cold War becomes known as the thaw, all right? So there's a little bit of a warming up between our powers. Okay, so the emergence of the Third World. So basically everyone who wasn't allied with the US or the Soviet Union became known as a third world nation, all right? That's pretty much what it comes down to, okay? So many of those not allied would be developing countries, so that is what, whenever we hear the term third world nation today, we associate it with developing countries, okay? But so, yeah, comes down to this rivalry, our Cold War era rivalry. Okay, so post-World War II era witnessed the crumbling of European empires, which is a push in the way of decolonization, okay? So this is happening in India, Pakistan, okay, and also the Middle East, where the U.S. replaced Britain as the major Western power. But so this decolonization that's happening in the 1950s and into the 1960s, pushing back against those global powers that have always been in place. So Britain, France, now the United States, okay? And this will take us into Vietnam, all right, who had been under French control. Okay, so let's see what was going on kind of leading up to the conflict that we call the Vietnam War, which they call the American War, okay? But, all right, so origins of the Vietnam War. All right, after the Japanese were expelled in 1945, the French moved in against Communist Ho Chi Minh and the nationalist independence movement that had taken there during that time. Okay, so anti-communism led by the U.S. Brings them deeper and deeper into any involvement in Vietnam. Okay, so Vietnam is divided at the 17th parallel, so this will divide North and South, communist, capitalist, okay? Alrighty, and little by little, the U.S. was becoming more accustomed to intervention, putting ourselves in the position of going abroad and spreading all those ideals such as democracy and freedom, which these are not new things. We've talked about this going back generations. So the start of the semester, we've seen this happening, but the U.S. getting involved in foreign affairs, okay, this interventionism, all right? Okay, and then our next slide, Rebels Without a Cause. This goes back to suburban culture when there's a rise in teenage lifestyle, that becomes popular. So rock and roll, the beat movement will come out of that. I'm not going to talk about it too much. Sorry. Moving ahead. Okay. All right. Beginning of the civil rights movement. We will really get into this in our next chapter, but we're seeing this coming out of our post-war era, early or late 1940s, but early post-war, okay? All right, so 1947, we have Jackie Robinson. And this is, like I said, the beginning of our movement of the civil rights conversation. But so whenever Jackie Robinson joins the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947, this became an indication that race relations were in flux. So that will kind of spur this conversation, all right? Okay. Moving right ahead a little bit. Okay. So, to secure these rights is the section I'm looking at. But so a commission on civil rights was appointed by Eisenhower, federal government, to abolish segregation and discrimination. Okay, so we will, like I said, we will talk about this more in our next chapter, but this is really the beginning of that push. This will fail early on, which is why we will talk about it more as we go. Okay, so 1948, Truman, going back, desegregated the armed forces. Okay, and this became a main push of the Democratic platform, okay? There's the creation of the NAACP. They are purging communists during this time. Okay, Cold War caused a shift in thinking and tactics among our civil rights groups. Okay, and then this takes us into the freedom movement. Okay, so. All right, origins of the movement. Okay, the Civil Rights Revolution came as a great surprise to many who just assumed that it would be a hushed conversation once again, okay? So, it comes as a surprise to many groups. 1950s was still, like I said, a very heavily segregated and unequal society. Think about our suburban section that we discussed. Okay, so segregation was legal in the South and border states, and de facto in the North, so just kind of accepted widely, that's what that means. And few Caucasians felt any urgency about confronting racial inequality. So like I said, whenever this came as a surprise, it's because people were, they were nonchalant about it. They just assumed that it would go away as a popular debate, okay? So, okay. All right, so the legal assault on segregation. Okay, so it fell to the courts to confront the problem of segregation. Like I said, groups like the NAACP are fighting against this. There are also groups like the League of United Latin American Citizens. Okay, and let's see, so for years, the NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall, attacked segregation, so acts like Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay. which takes us to the case of Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, so Thurgood Marshall brought the NAACP's support to local cases, and so in 1952, before the Supreme Court, Marshall argued such a case in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Okay. So Marshall argued that segregation did lifelong damage to African American children, undermining their self-esteem. And we had talked about this before. By the turn of the century, there were no African American high schools in the South. Okay. So this is what he's talking about. He's talking about this widespread pattern of this in the South, okay? Okay, so Chief Justice Earl Warren managed to create, what am I trying to say? Trying to create, oh, okay, yeah. So tried to achieve a unanimous vote in a divided court where some members disliked segregation but feared that this would create anarchy, okay? And the court decision stated that segregation in public education violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, okay? So that happened in 1952. Okay, so 1955, we have the Montgomery bus boycott. Okay, so the Brown case ensured that when the movement resumed after waning in the early 1950s, would have the backing of the federal courts, okay? We have the case of Rosa Parks, which leads to the Montgomery bus boycott. This launched a nonviolent crusade for social justice. This is when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Becomes a central figure in the movement. Okay. From the beginning, the language of freedom pervaded the African American movement. We have what are known as freedom schools. Okay. So this is stuff that we will get into over our next chapter. Okay. Okay, so the leadership of King. Okay. Oh. All right, so Dr. King was known as a profound orator, speaker, that is. Okay. And he presented the case of African American rights in a vocabulary that merged with the African American experience, merged that with that of the nation. Okay, and he did this in echoing Christian themes. This came out of his background, okay? And his speeches resonated deeply in both African American communities and with the broader culture, okay? All right, so massive resistance. So in 1956, King formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This refused to accept the Brown decision, okay? In 1956, many Southern congressmen and senators signed a Southern Manifesto denouncing Brown. So, anyway, yeah, this just reiterates everything I've been saying about Southern animosity during this time. Sorry, I started going down a rabbit hole of a thought. Okay, so Eisenhower and civil rights. Okay, federal government tried to remain aloof from the African American struggle, and a 1957 civil rights law had weak enforcement. In addition to that, President Eisenhower failed to provide moral leadership. Okay, so, yeah, not ideal to begin with, not a huge amount of support coming from coming about in a way that was anticipated, okay? All right, in 1957 in Little Rock, the governor used the National Guard to prevent the court-ordered integration of the Central High School there. So we have, actually, let me just go to our next slide. So this is the Little Rock Nine, our first group of students who attend high school there, okay? But yeah, the National Guard had to be called out, and the students were then escorted inside to make sure that they were safe in entering the building, okay? So yeah, Eisenhower dispatched federal troops to enforce the order. The incident demonstrated the effectiveness of massive resistance. So since the start of the Cold War, American leaders had worried about the impact of segregation and the effect it would have on the U.S. international reputation. Okay, the global reaction to the Brown decision was overwhelmingly positive, but the slowness of the change invited criticism and embarrassed American diplomats. Okay, so the election in 1960. We are at the tail end of the decade, the 1950s. Okay, so it comes down to John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon. So the presidential campaign of 1960 between these two turned out to be one of the closest in history. And the fact that JFK was Catholic became a campaign issue. The average citizen is still, oh, sorry, my computer's doing something weird. Let's get that out of here. Okay. There's still a lot of divide between, Catholic individuals, Protestant individuals, and so JFK's Catholicism became a talking point in regards to this during the 1960 election, okay? So both Kennedy and Nixon were ardent Cold Warriors, okay? So anti-communist. Okay, and this is our first television debate, okay? It is detrimental to Richard Nixon because everyone will remember how nervous and sweaty he comes across on camera and how cool, calm, and collected JFK came across, okay? But so, this is our first televised election. Okay, so with Eisenhower's farewell address, he warned against the drumbeat of calls for a new military buildup, okay, which would become our military-industrial complex. But so he kind of spoke out against the direction that a lot of things would end up going. So we will talk about that more. But yeah, that's the tail end, like I said, of the 50s. Now we will get into the 60s. We will see the civil rights movement will grow in scale. Okay, we will get into another war in Vietnam, unfortunately, and that will go into the 70s. But yeah, so I will see you guys for chapter 24 or 25 whenever we get into that decade. Okay, if you guys have any questions about anything, please give me a shout and I will talk to you later. Okay, bye.